Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Shira Coleman. I am our children's buyer here at the Booksmith, and I also do sustainability stuff, and I'm your host for the evening. We're so excited to introduce essayist, short fiction writer, critic, and novelist Cleyvis Natera. She was born in the Dominican Republic, migrated to the United States at 10 years old, and grew up in New York City. She holds a BA from Skidmore College and an MFA from New York University. Her writing has won awards and fellowships from PEN America, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the Kenyon Review Writers Workshops, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. She lives with her husband and 2 young children in Montclair, New Jersey. Show Cleyvis some love. Cleyvis will be joined by New York Times bestselling author Leila Mottley. Her book, Nightcrawling, was nominated for the Booker Prize. Woo! Woo! And the PEN Hemingway Award. Leila is the 2018 Oakland Youth Poet Laureate. Born in 2002, she is a student at Smith College and lives in Oakland. Everyone, please show some love and let's get started.
I'm glad they didn't say when I was born.
I don't know. They did it to me. They did it to me. For the rest of my career. Everyone will know my birthday. Oh, right. I'm doing this. This is my first time moderating, so bear with us here. But I am so excited to be here with my good friend Cleyvis, and celebrating this beautiful book's paperback release. I want to start with just, a basic background on the book. Can you share a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you to my dear friend Leila. Leila and I met because we both got published by the same publishing company. And before we knew she was going to be a meteoric star, we did this Zoom thing for librarians. And
yeah,
that's when we met.
Uh-huh.
And Leila was so sweet. She sent me a DM through Instagram, was like, want to be friends? And I was like, I would love to be friends.
I agonized about it. I was like, can I just DM her? I don't know. Is this normal? And she responded with such grace.
Immediately.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, I'm so excited. So we switched ARCs, our advanced books.
Mm-hmm.
And we read each other's books and became instant best friends.
Yeah.
Because I think what you've done with Nightcrawling is just groundbreaking and beautiful. And I love your book. So thank you she's working on a lot of different projects and on her next book.
As
so
are
I feel
you.
I feel very honored that you came out. So thank you for being out here. Thank you everybody for coming. I got some familiar faces and then some not familiar faces. So it's wonderful that you all have made it out. So Neruda on the Park is a book about a family in crisis. It's about what happens in this northern Manhattan Dominican immigrant community when gentrification arrives. So there's a building that is knocked down, and very quickly the inhabitants learn that there's a luxury building that's going to take its place, ushering in gentrification, which has somehow missed this community. The story centers the lives of 2 women, a mother and daughter. And so the mother comes up with this escalating scheme of crimes to scare white people into not moving into the neighborhood. And the daughter, also has a life-altering event happen early on in the book that ushers her kind of search for identity and self and home. And she ends up falling in love with the developer of the building. So a lot of tension between the generations and, a celebration ultimately of home and family and the difficulties that exist in all of that. So how did I do?
Incredible. That was the best description of any book I've ever heard. Seriously.
I'm just going to take you with me.
I say I don't know when people ask me what's about my book. I think one of the most beautiful parts about Cleyvis as a writer and this book in particular is just how unapologetic you are, how daring you are to not have to over-explain, to make your reader think, to make your reader question. And truly this book is layered. It contends with so much from this complex mother-daughter relationship to kind of what displacement means and how we stake a claim in our homes, to this idea of what is reality, and how do we contend with kind of the reality falling apart, and with our disparate realities. It's just a stunning book. So we're going to talk about gentrification and New York and all of that, but I want to start with talking about Luz and Eusebia, the mother and daughter in this book, and about your construction and the journey to this book being here with us today. So I know it took you 15 years. Over the course of 15 years you wrote this book, and I know it started with Luz, and then Eusebia's voice kind of came in later. Is that right?
Yeah.
So how did that happen? What was the journey to get here today, and how did you end up landing with those perspectives we see in this book, not just Luz and Eusebia, but the Tongues, who are these 3 older women in the community, kind of the all-knowing people in their neighborhood, and then Kuka, and kind of this huge cast of characters. Kuka's Eusebia's sister. We get to learn about so many of their different lives. So how did you settle on the perspectives in this book?
Yeah, well, settling on the perspective was really tough for me, because I started out wanting to write. So I wrote this book at the heels of a failed book. I went to graduate school. I wrote a book that I thought was gonna do really well, and it didn't. Like, I got an agent right out of my graduate program, and she thought we had a good shot, but ultimately the book didn't sell. And I put that book away, and I was quite heartbroken. So I decided that I was gonna write this like really sexy book about this young woman who comes home from college, and her mom is in the background doing all this crazy stuff, but she's just like living her best life and having lots of sex. It was not autobiographical, okay? I was not having lots of sex and lots of fun. But I wasn't even planning to put my name on it, okay? Like, I was just like, this is gonna make me all this money, and then I'm gonna be able to write my little weird books nobody wants to buy. And 15 years later, here I am. So be careful. I tell my writing students now, like, just be careful what you decide for a rebound book. So I started out with this first person narrative by this young woman who's like really trying to find her place, and she feels displaced from her community and feels displaced from her, and also like she's working in a hostile environment, which was really important to me to explore. So she's working in a hostile environment, and she's kind of like in between worlds where she didn't quite fit in anywhere. And the part that was really hard to pull off was that, like, the idea for the plot engine, I knew all along was going to be the mother and these crimes. But with a first person narrative, it just didn't make any sense. Like, I couldn't pull it off. So then the second attempt was to write it from the Tongue's perspective. So I wrote the entire book from like these 3 chismosas. They're like these 3 women who love to gossip, and they were a little bit more like mystical. Like it was, there is an element of magical realism in my book, but in that book, it was like the perspective itself was a magical perspective, because they could go in and out of everybody's perspectives. Especially the people who volunteer to like do the crimes, to be criminals or be victims of the crimes. And that one, that story, I had a lot of fun, and I got like some agents to read it. But interestingly, there was just something that wasn't missing. Like, I know I wanted the story to be about community, but there were too many people telling the story. And I remember taking, I participated in a writing workshop. I was pregnant, I remember, with my son who's 10 now. And I went to this writing workshop, and the teacher was like, but whose story is it? And I was like, I don't know. You tell me. I'm paying you to tell me. So then I was like, oh, damn it. I got to make up my mind whose story it was. And the part was that I was so scared to write the mother's perspective. And like, there was a part of me that just knew that was where the story hinged. Because this idea that someone could love their community so much that they would talk people into risking their well-being.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, I knew that the story would end up with her putting the community at greater risk than it had been when she started. And I didn't know why. Like, why would someone do that? And I think I was really nervous and scared to explore and find out. So, I took a lot of breaks. I mean, during the time when I was writing this book, I was working a full-time job the entire time. And I fell in love and I had some kids, And then, there was a time in my life where I was really like, oh my God, time is passing. Things are happening. Like, if I don't fix this book, like, I'm not going to be a writer. Like, it's just not going to happen for me. And so at that point, I decided to really come back. And I had become a mom. So then all of a sudden, it was like something really opened up in me where I was like, oh, I know. It's like she loves her community as a child. And what I knew from becoming a mother is that you love your children in like a deranged way sometimes. Like, when they're babies, you look at them and you're like, I would kill somebody for you. And the baby's just like, feed me. Like, they're not asking you to murder anybody. But you have like these ideas about like what you would be willing to do. And it really, for me, opened up something, an understanding of like this woman's. And I also knew that there was a deep trauma that she had survived, that she had never faced. And that was something that also I had been scared to write about because it was very painful. And then I decided to go for it and to include Eusebia's perspective. And when I gave her, then I had to compromise because I was like, okay, I had written this whole book from the tongues, these women, and they kept pulling at me. They wouldn't shut up. They're the tongues because they're gossipy. And they would be like in my head, like, bitch, you better put us in this book. So I ended up like deciding to have these little interludes where, they're like the Greek chorus. So they just come in and they give you this background and they give you like a lot of context that neither of the two women can give you. And so like ultimately I decided on this kind of tapestry of voices. And I, at the end I felt really good. Like when I had it, after being so scared for so many years, it was like the minute I said, just go for it. And I'm so happy now that I did, because I just feel like the book wasn't the book it was meant to be until I gave into needing to write like the more complex character, which is like this woman that ultimately becomes a monster,
It really does feel like a song, the ways that like the two perspectives and then with the interludes from the tongues, the way that they kind of talk to each other feels like some kind of dance. And there's a way that Luce, her chapters tend to be like more fast paced. They have a lot of dialogue in them. It's action, and then with Eusebia we get inside of her head and we kind of get to experience her internal world and all of the complications of it. And I think it's really interesting and beautiful the way that you're able to hold so many of these things at once, and to hold this mother-daughter relationship that's really not simple. We feel the contention between them. We feel this push and pull. We also feel like the immense amount of love. How did you think about the way that they interacted with each other and kind of the conversation between their chapters?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I mean, you're such a great reader. See, I knew you were. I was like, Leila's my person. Thank you for taking such care with this book. So what I knew I wanted was like an inversion to happen between the two stories. Like I wanted the beginning of like this, because I think that's the way we think about stories a lot of time when we're thinking about coming of age, or like what's the most important thing that happens in our lives. A lot of times we think it's like when we're younger, like in our 20s, that like these things happen that kind of break us and they make us like then we become the people we're meant to be. But I was like, I think it happens at every stage of our lives, actually, that we are remaking ourselves, that life kicks our ass and we have to like continuously confront who we think we are versus who we actually are. And so, I wanted to start out with like, and it was a big risk I took, because I wanted to start from a really familiar place with the book. Like I wanted to start with this young woman, like you recognize her. She's like high achieving, highly accomplished, very attractive, you know? And then she has been working in an environment where she has been very successful, but she feels very unhappy. But you would recognize that from like most coming of age stories, right? And then her mother starts out like being like very, also like kind of a predictable character, where she's, you know, she's dedicated to her family. You know, like a lot of the early scenes are Luz contending with work and contending with the outside world, while her mother is just contending with making sure the eggs don't have eggshell, making sure the toasts are toasted correctly, you know, making sure there's not wet spots on the floor for when her husband Vladimir wakes up. So I wanted like this feeling that things were like the person living the real life is her daughter. She's the one that's like out in the world. And then like by chapter 4, you know, which is maybe like 40 pages into the book, an inversion happens where like a reader will realize that like the real engine is Eusebia, because she comes up with this idea and she comes up with a list of what they might have to do to stop like these invaders. And, you know, by the time you get to like the 3rd chapter and you realize that she's working the list, you're like, oh shit, like she's working the list, and you know what else is left on the list. So then I felt like then there's gonna be like this engine of like plot, which I wasn't very good at plot. I think that's part of the reason why it took me so long to like get this book right. But you know what I knew about these two women is that they loved each other very deeply. So they were like, you know, at the heart of the relationship is love, and then at the heart of the relationship is also a misunderstanding or maybe like an assumption they've each made about what it will take for the other one to be happy. But neither one is willing to ask or tell. So they're like each keeping these secrets about what actually it would mean to be happy. And they both feel very obligated to the other to be happy, you know, or like pretend to be happy. So I knew those were kind of like the pieces that I wanted to work with. And then writing the book ended up like, once I really decided it was like these two women, and then the tongues were going to come and interrupt. Then I was just having a lot of fun, because I was like, you know, I wanted to, this is what I thought. This is so nerdy. Please buy my book. I was like, what if the book is an artifact? You know what I mean? Like, this is about gentrification. It's about spaces. And I kept thinking about the book itself, you know, is an artifact. It's like an object. And I wanted the object to be like a city so that it would be like reflective. So, you know, I created like scenes, and only because I had, you know, 10 years of writing it, where I was like, I want the scenes to be mirrors of each other, but not obvious mirrors. So there's like, you know, they both fall in love with men that like ask them to go somewhere that seems otherworldly, you know? And then like, what would it mean for one woman to be able to say no, where like one woman had to say yes? Or like, what would it mean for, like, I thought a lot about language in the book as an artifact. And I thought about how like what we inherit. So I grew up speaking Spanish, and I was thinking about like what I learned from my mother. And I thought about this a lot as a parent. Like, I am teaching my child the language that they use to understand the world. And that's the artifact of writing a book. But I'm writing the book in a language my mother doesn't speak. And in my book, Eusebia understands English but doesn't speak it. And so for me, it was also like thinking about creating scenes where I would use the same language, but it would be completely different, because the mother's life and her understanding of language and what she was able to experience was so completely different from her daughter. So like, you know, the hardest scene to write is like a scene where Eusebia's in the hospital, and I used the same set of words. Like, I picked 20 words. And I was like, I need to like write a scene where Luz is experiencing love for the first time. Like real, like love, like making love and feeling loved and giving love. And it was like a mirror. So but if you read the book, you wouldn't even know. If I read it out loud, you'd be like, oh, there's like these words that repeat, but completely differently in these two scenes. So that's what I wanted to do with the book, was like create these like kind of reflective moments, mirror moments. I wanted to like create the structure of the book so that it would make you realize that like the bodies of the women are the bodies of the neighborhood, are the bodies of the city, are the bodies of this country, you know? Because I think that to me is interesting to think about how like any place you live becomes you and you are the place.
There's so much in there. I mean, I think so much of this book is like a contemplation on love and on desire, and the way that these two women experience desire within themselves and their own lives, but also the way that they experience like agency and wanting in relation to a world that often doesn't think about what they want. And we see with like Vladimir's idea that Eusebia really wants to go back to the Dominican Republic. And kind of this miscommunication, but also this idea that like no one ever pauses to ask them, how did you as like a writer and a person contend with what it would mean to center their desires?
Well, I thought a lot about like the differences in generations. I mean, like, I'm not convinced that and this is a book that's very concerned with womanhood. And it's concerned with womanhood in the context of masculinity. So, like, both these women are with men who are, like, very strong-willed, very loving, and, you know, non-traditional in many ways. But really, like, the women are functioning in, like, environments where even when they are in work environments where other women are in charge, the women are winning because they act like men. You know, so that to me was important, to be like really center the stories of the women in a context where you would understand like what is at play is like this idea of like the masculine being more often the way to win as a woman.
Right.
And so, you know, I thought a lot about like in my family, like the women, I just grew up with a lot of really powerful women. And so even when the women were limited in their choices, like there was agency. So for me, like, I don't think it's that simple. Like, damn, the patriarchy. Like, you know, I just don't think it's that simple. Like, I think women have always had ways of like having their wills, following their wills, and having their way. And so, you know, I really was very interested in exploring that idea of like agency and how we each are responsible still for like speaking or choosing not to speak. Because, you know, very early on in the book, I remember writing this scene where like they're being very loving and like Luz doesn't want to tell her mom she's lost her job and her mom doesn't want to tell her like different things. And so, you know, I was like, oh, in this moment, like if these two women would just tell the truth, I'd have no book. It's like when you're reading watching a movie and you're like, oh, this whole thing would make no sense if somebody just told the truth, you know? And so, and I feel like in my own life, that has happened a lot where, you know, I think I was pretty old the first time I asked my mother, like, are you happy? Do you wish you had a different life? And it was like the same fear that kept me from writing Eusebia's perspective. It's like the reason that I didn't ask my mother, because I wanted to live in a fantasy that my mother was happy, that sacrificing and like doing everything she had to do for us was like the meaningful part of her life. And, you know, it's not surprising that when I asked her, like, no, she wouldn't have done any of it, right? And so, but I still think there's something really important about talking about who we are as women, the choices we get to make and don't get to make, and our own responsibility in choosing not to pursue what we want. Because I think it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, so much of it's about like the resistance that each of them have, both in their small worlds, the way that they resist. I mean, what's expected of them. Luz, from the get, is kind of contending and experiencing the conflict of like, who am I supposed to be and what does success even mean? Right. And then Eusebia is kind of having this conflict between like, does what I want matter? Yeah. And she also experiences some like kind of twist of what is real and how that impacts her actions. I mean, I think it's such a way that we get to lens through which we get to see how we all kind of experience alterations to reality when we're grasping for home and for survival and for all of these things that we want. Can we talk a little bit about the setting for the book? Nother Park is not actually a neighborhood in New York.
No.
And as someone who's not from New York, I while I was reading it, I was like, is this real? It feels real. And I would look up a map and I'd be like, I can't find it. Why did you choose to create this fictional neighborhood instead of setting it, somewhere like Washington Heights? Why was it important that it is its own place, and how did you go about the world building?
Yeah, so like the first thing I thought, and this was another thing I thought on like year 7.5, where I was like, this might never happen. So let me do something I've never seen done. I wanted to the first idea I had was that I wanted to put around the park like all the places where I had lived. And so, I lived in a tenement building when we first moved to the United States. Well, I first moved in my grandmother's house, apartment, and that's 600. That's actually where they live, and it's physically the apartment where my grandmother, all of us lived there. My grandmother had 12 children, and at one point or another, all of us lived in this, 4-bedroom apartment in Washington Heights. So, I wanted that, 600 West to be in the place where they live. And then when we moved to the Bronx, me and my family, we lived in this apartment building that was a tenement, and next to it there was a burnt out tenement. And I just when I was 11 years old, we would look, and the rats, I mean, now you see them and it's not shocking because now the rats are little dogs running around New York City. But back then, the rats were little, when I was growing up, and we would see these rats, dashing into that, and that place became for me in my mind such a mysterious place. And there was a version of this book where Luz and her friends they're just always drinking in there, and so that burnt out building that ends up being torn down played a bigger role, and a lot of that got cut, but so I put that building there as a tenement that gets torn down. And then I spent a lot of time in graduate school. My friend Ryan's here. We went to graduate school together. He's a great writer. And I wanted to so the park itself kind of resembles the park where I went to graduate school, and some of the little brownstones that are around that park. And then I lived in I spent a lot of time in Brooklyn, so I brought some of those smaller buildings. So I kept thinking if I'm gonna create a neighborhood, I'm gonna create a neighborhood where there's no boundary. There's no boundary between the boroughs, right? Because a lot of what I wanted to do is collapse the boundaries between the borders, right? As an immigrant writer, for me, it was also really important to think about how do we collapse borders when we're thinking about home. And I wanted to create around this park all my homes. And so that was the first idea I had. And then I wanted to create the name of the park for it to be really hard for people to say it. So Nothar Park is Nothar. And I remember when I was learning English, TH is an especially difficult sound for Spanish speakers to make. And I was like, I'm going to make English speakers have a hard time saying the name of this neighborhood. So you could feel it in your own tongue, Nothar. It's a difficult, awkward sound. And I feel that's what English does for a lot of us. It's just a difficult thing to wrap your tongue around. So nerdy things like that I wanted to do. And I wanted so there's this joke that the people have in the neighborhood, which is that slutty people, the slutty women from DR live in the south of the country, which is where I'm from, by the way. So Eusebia says the putas, the grillos live in the south. And then this, so also as the Dominican Republic, they think of the park and the neighborhood as the Dominican Republic. So they think this kind of people live on the north side, this kind of people live on the west and the east, these kind of people live on the south side. So this idea that what hovers and the ghost that lives in this neighborhood is also the ghost of their lives, which is the country where the parents came from.
And I mean, you construct this sense of home, and then you present this threat to it. And I mean, there are parallels between New York City and the Bay Area, and kind of this idea of what does it mean to be displaced. And this book creates, I mean, so it asks so many questions about what our role and responsibilities are as people living in places where we are constantly feeling like under threat. And are we, should we stay when staying is incredibly difficult, when we kind of are forced into making ourselves small, into feeling that like the place you love doesn't love you back. How do we think about that versus leaving and like allowing your home to be taken over? And what does it look like to watch a place that you love become unrecognizable? How did you start with thinking about like that as a conflict in the book, and then how did you answer those questions for yourself, and continually create this complexity of like there's no real answer about what we're supposed to do. There's no way to solve gentrification, but we all are like faced with questions about how do we navigate it within our own lives. How did you think about that for each of these characters, and for the book as a whole?
Damn. I feel like I'm going to come up with a better answer tomorrow, but I'll try. I'll try. That's a really good question. I mean, I thought a lot about, my own neighborhood went through a great deal of change from the time I was a child to now. It's absolutely unrecognizable. I mean, I grew up between Harlem and Washington Heights, and like, it's just like you wouldn't know it if you walked through it. And so, what I remember thinking as I was growing, and especially during the 15 years when I was working on the book, was how like my life really resembled that like kind of violent force. So it was like me going away to college and coming back. And it was like all of a sudden I'm like, everybody's really proud of me, but very suspicious of me. Like, like I sounded different. My values had changed. I started losing my language, in some ways. Like I couldn't speak the same Spanish that my family members spoke anymore because I'd been pretty much gone for 4 years, even though I was in upstate New York, but it was like a very different environment culturally. And, I just remember like in my own family and my own community, like there was this kind of strange hostility where like people were just like, what did you have to give up? What did you sell out to fit in? And so even though people are proud of you, at the same time, they become very suspicious. And sometimes they won't have certain conversations. Or I would call people out when they were being ignorant, so all of a sudden it was like, oh, Cleyvis the police. Don't talk about gay people. Don't talk about black people. Don't talk about, and so all of a sudden it's like these things that are happening where, and I was young too. Like I probably didn't do a lot of the things when like it comes to like trying to negotiate and like help people learn different ways. I was probably kind of obnoxious about it, and about my politics, when I came back home. And so that was the first thing I noticed was like a displacement that happened to me within my own family. And then it was like this displacement that happened to me through work. Because I was like the worker bee, high achieving, like very accomplished. But like I worked in a really tough place. And I was lucky because I was very successful at it. But like it was like you just had to like learn to survive, to like speak the language and look like everybody else and like sound like everybody else and eat the same foods everybody else eats. And so I remember like there also being like, oh, I know how to win this game because I know how to just be like everybody else. And that was another thing that I felt like this erasure of the self, and how much I got rewarded. Like the more willing I was to like give up things, I was rewarded richly. And then like the physical change that happened in the neighborhood itself, where like so something really strange happened during like 10 years, let's say, where like at the beginning it was like people are getting, the landlords wouldn't cash the checks, like really underhanded shit to like get people kicked out of their apartments. And then at one point, it was like these women in our communities were like fighting Columbia University to not move north, like, you know, fighting, like calling out the landlords. Like I just saw a lot of examples of people stepping up, and it was mostly women that were like stepping up, going to the community board meetings, who were like, you know, calling out the landlords, really like advocating for people that otherwise would have been in really bad situations. And I was thinking about how, you know, like anytime that we think about social revolutions in our communities, like so often it's the men who like come out as like the saviors, you know, but so often like the grit and the daily work of like salvaging our communities falls on women. And so I really wanted to like think about that and contend with that in the book. But I also thought that it had to be something like seductive. So like this is the thing that for me was hard, that it's like everybody's like gentrification is very bad. Yes. Also, beautiful buildings with like gym. Like I bought a luxury apartment in my community, and like it was really nice having a door person. It was really nice having a gym. It was really nice having like 2 bathrooms. You know, I grew up in a home where like 10 people shared a bathroom, you know? And so like we deserve those things too.
Yeah.
It's not, the building is not the bad thing. The developers are not necessarily the horrible people. It's like the idea that the only way that communities are deserving of that is to usher in a different class of people. And so, you know, I wanted to contend with that, the difficulty of that. So, you know, when I came up with Hudson and this really sexy man, you know, and I was like, again, like he was a construct from 22-year-old Cleyvis. And I was like, he's going to be the hottest man in the whole world. But I also wanted like this very wealthy, like billionaire person to also like be hopeless in a way. Because he had tried to go out and like save the world in his own way. He was trying to like contribute to like a fight against climate change. And he learned very early on that even like there are some fights you can win no matter how wealthy you are. And so I wanted there to be this kind of question about the seduction that comes with class and wealth, and like being part of like a circle of people that seem like for all intents and purposes to be like what you should aspire to be. And for that to be like this kind of compelling, seductive movement in the book. But you know, like the big thing about when you're talking about people contending with home, what I knew I really wanted, which is like the hardest thing for me, was that I wanted like this mother to be someone who's so filled with rage that the moment she falls down and it cracks open, it's gonna create like a monstrosity. Because I think that, like, you know, most of our countries, most of our cultures, like the reason that our countries are able to stand is because women are not able to like voice their rage. I think that like in my family, I've seen it. I see it constantly in, you know, in the discourse of this country, other countries that I travel to. And I feel like it's on our backs. It's on the backs of women who like learn how to like hold all this rage in. And so this idea of contending with home and like what you would do to save it is also contending with rage. And the fact that like more often than not, whether it's class or not so much gender even, but like if those of us who are like oppressed allowed our rage out, the whole thing would be burned to the ground. And so I wanted like to have one character that like shows us that movement.
On that note, will you read for us?
Oh yeah. Look at that. That worked
I
so
know.
well. Did we plan this? No. I'm going to read just a tiny bit from the book so you can hear. In this section, this is a section in the book where Luz and her, it's from Eusebia, like the mother's perspective. And all you need to know really is that like they've been having a relationship. They're having a conversation with Cuca, who is about Eusebia's sister, who went to the Dominican Republic to get this crazy makeover, plastic surgery. And Luz was just talking about how like women can win, how, you know, like whether you give into the pressures of society or you don't, like there's no winning. And then we get into Eusebia's mind. So she says, this would have been a good time for Eusebia to say she, in fact, was one of those women. She should have said she needed a doctor, the day she fell in the park, that the pressure in her head had in fact persisted. But because of that pressure, she was finding new space inside herself as well. From that bright, gorgeous burst of red that had emerged when she fell down in the park, a new reality emerged as well. She'd all but lost her appetite, but unlike in the past, when lack of nourishment had made her weak and lethargic, she was now focused and deliberate. So what if she swung from feeling powerful and effervescent to disoriented and unsure? Eusebia knew she was meant to yield all this new energy and the rage it often birthed into a plan to keep everyone she loved safe in their homes. She had to admit there were moments, like now, when the rage dissipated and left in its stead the sad certainty it was all futile. How could she, of all people, stop them from being forced out? And worse still, what if she ended up hurting instead of helping? If she didn't take steps to save her community, no one would. That truth had to be worth the risk. What she'd often found charming about her people, the joy that flowed through everyone's veins, even when times were most difficult, how they drank and partied and bullshitted, even when the more prudent thing to do was act in revolt, wasn't resilience in action, but acquiescence. Knowing that, accepting that meant she couldn't do anything but stay the course. So what of these visions, of her growing impatience, of the ways in which she slowly recognized a voice from somewhere inside her that said, do whatever it takes to make sure it ends where it should? This was the voice she had enough presence of mind still to recognize as an unstoppable reckoning. I'll stop there.
I think that the device of Eusebia's falling and then having that be kind of the catalyst for so much of what changes for her and so many of the things that she does in the novel is so poignant, partially because we see, these women's bodies as sites for both like trauma and resistance throughout the book. With, I think, Kuka's is really interesting. We get to see like this conflict between the way that Kuka, she was like, I need to lose weight, I'm gonna go and like have it done and it'll be quick and then I'll be beautiful and my husband who's cheating on me will want me. And then she comes back home and some of the other women, especially Eusebia, are like, you shouldn't have done this, like you shouldn't harm yourself. And then we see with Eusebia falling and her like literal bleeding that it is both kind of the beginning of a lot of harm, but also the beginning of her kind of getting to be liberated. And then with Luce, we see kind of sex as a resistant practice for her to get to like experience desire and pleasure outside of like this very uniform world that she's lived in. Can we talk about sex for a minute?
Let's.
I think that in so many circles, like literary novels are like not supposed to have sex, which is so interesting because literary novels are also supposed to somehow like be, so real, and then there's no sex allowed. And I love getting to see that this was like such an important part of the book. Did you ever get any pushback about including sex in the book and including it as like just a like hot part of the novel, like not having it have to like be part of even the like primary plot, that it is part of Luce's humanity? How did you go about the decision to have that remain like a huge part of the book, especially as it like started kind of this whole idea when you were out of college, and you intentionally kept it in? Why?
Yeah, I mean, how? I think like there were a few things. I mean, one thing that I learned You already know. It's gonna be messy. One of the things that I knew from my first book that failed is that I think like part of the reason why my first book failed is because I was so willing to like compromise everything to just get it published that I ruined the book. And so, you know, one of the things that drove me to want to write this kind of like chick lit book is because I actually felt like I don't think sex is represented honestly in literary books. And, you know, I grew up reading a lot of romance novels. And let me tell you, I knew from reading romance novels that sex is a propulsive element. Like, you want to create tension, have two people really want to have sex and don't let them. You know, like people will keep reading till I get to the good stuff. And so, you know, I just remember like, you know, working on this book and like through each version of the book, like the sex stayed. Because I was like, I'm not giving up on the idea that there's a way to do it that can be sexy, that can be a propulsive element of tension, but also that like will show us actually like what it means to have agency in sex, because that's like another thing that I feel like I haven't seen a lot. And we talk a lot about like literature being this exploration of the human condition. And I'm like, how is this when like sex itself is a battleground for agency and the lack of agency, where like I feel like women so often don't even have conversations about pleasure really with our mothers. And like there's like this whole thing between Eusebia and Luz where Eusebia kind of hands the idea of sex to her sister because she's not willing to like have those conversations. It's too uncomfortable. So that to me was very important. It was like, I wanted like for Luz to really be like very much the aggressor in her relationship. Like, and I didn't want to like cut to black. Like, I'm like, no, she's gonna hold a penis and guide it into her body. You know what I mean? Like she's gonna ride them in and she's gonna have an orgasm. Like, you know, and what's so crazy to me is that I was really worried because, I mean, like, again, it's not like the whole book is not sex, but there's enough sex in it where, like, this is not a joke, you know? And I just remember, like, you know, my literary agent is gay. And, you know, I remember when I sent him the revision of the book, you know, I was like, oh my God, like, he's going to make me cut this stuff, you know? Because I felt like I got bolder. Like once I really figured out that like my writing was up to par, like I would go back and make the sex more sexy, like more bold, you know? And I would think about like the best sex of my life and like make it be good on the page, you know? And like I said before, this is not autobiographical. I did not have such hot sex in case my husband is like, but it was like, you know, it was like, I was like, I think I can do it. I think I can do it. So when my agent read it, he loved it. He was like, this is so, and he was like, I haven't read a book that does it this way. And so he was like, let's go. And when my editor, so a young woman, she's younger than me, and she was like, I remember when like she bought the book and we're going through it together and like she just had like track changes like yes I was like, I did my job, you know, like I did it. So yeah, so each stage I would get like really flustered because I would think about like these copy editors like reading these kind of sexy scenes. But I don't know, I just think it's really important to me. My book was chosen in the fall for like an all reads at a high school. And I was like, ay, Dios mío, like, how am I going to face these young people? You know, like I was like getting so hot thinking about them, like asking me questions about that part. But, you know, like I think like part of what I wanted to show in the book is like that you can say no when things don't feel right. I wanted to show men saying no to sex because I also feel like we don't see that in fiction. Like we don't see men exercising their right to slow down the pace when like they're with an aggressive woman. And I wanted to show Luz as a younger woman like exercising the agency to like get pleasure out of sex. Because I feel like for me, that felt like a groundbreaking responsibility as like a woman writing in this day and age, that like women should have good sex. Women should have orgasms. Women should practice care and safety when it comes to their bodies, and they should demand it of their partners. And I felt like I wanted that to be in the book. And so, yeah, like it was a very joyful thing that I really felt like all of this is gonna get caught. So I was like, yeah, go for it. And then it didn't get caught. And and sometimes when people tell me they're reading my book, I'm just like, don't look at me, like, because it's like you can be quite bold. And then when people come to you, like to your events, and you're like, oh, you read the whole thing? Like the whole book?
We're about to get to questions, but before we go, before we finish here, I just want to ask you one last question. Okay. A lot of the book is about like what does success mean? What does it mean in terms of like the American dream? What does it mean in retirement? What does it mean in our careers, in our homes, and in like every facet of life? What does success mean to you now?
Oh my goodness. I feel like I've been so lucky that I've lived like 10 lives in one life, because I feel like coming to this country as a 10-year-old and being split, like I was split from my mom first when she first traveled here, and we were with my father. And then when we traveled here, I was split from my dad. But then my mom had to work 24 hours a day to like support the four of us and to get us an apartment. So like I feel like what I experienced as displacement and separation was like really stark very early on in my life. And I really bought into this idea very early on that like happiness would be material success. That like the way that I would pay my mother for her sacrifice, my father for his heartbreak, would be to like have all these things. And the more money, the more worth it for all of us, And what I learned pretty early on is that like, I was so successful in this other career, and it was like the more money I made, I give Luz this emptiness that lives inside her body, because I wanted like to find a way to talk about that. Like this sense of like a vacuum inside of us. And I think like part of the reason why all of us are so driven and like we burn ourselves to the ground, like, this country is the most unhealthy country in the whole world because of it. And it's because we have to like keep filling the void with things. And what we've been promised by the American dream is this idea that like the more successful and the more material goods we have, like the more moral we are, like good, and then the happier we'll be. But it isn't true. I mean, I found, and I was making money that maybe for like most American families wouldn't seem like that much, but I remember making $100,000 in salary when I was 29 years old, and thinking like I'm probably making more money than 10 family members combined, And yet, like, I really wasn't happier. I wasn't. So I think like I'm very lucky because I have gotten to a point where I was able to make this decision about pursuing my writing. And I was able, and I don't want to be ungrateful because I actually had really good experiences as a worker, and I worked with like incredibly supportive people my entire life. But it was like, I feel like really lucky because I called bullshit on this idea of like material success when I was younger enough that I could pivot my life to do what I love to do, which is to write. And the thing that's crazy is that, I've been able to make like a good living at it. Like, it's like all the fears that I had that I was being irresponsible for my children and for my mom. And, it wasn't true because I've been able to live I'm on year 3. So buy my book, please. But it's like, I'm making a good living and like my life hasn't changed that drastically. But I don't know. I think for me, like success is like, it changed a lot. Like for me, success now is being more actively involved in my community. Success is like lifting people up, so a lot of like what I do now is like mentorship and giving away everything I learned by doing it wrong for 20 years. But like success is really like getting to sit down and write and like be like, this is gonna be my life, whether or not I can drive the fanciest car or whether I can live in the best zip code. Like this is a better life. And I was on a path where I think I could have made a lot more money than maybe I'll make as a writer, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like it took me a really long time to ask myself the questions I'm making my characters ask in this book. And the book is 6 months. So they're asking themselves questions that I feel like it took me like 30 years to ask. And I hope that, asking it in the book and having readers ask themselves those questions will bring about a reckoning within their own lives about like what we're willing to cut away of ourselves for work, what we're willing to cut away of our relationships and the love we feel for other people, because of what society is telling us it means to be successful.
All right, we're gonna take some questions. There's a mic, but we're a small group. I think you might be able to just shout it out. I know you guys are dying to ask Cleyvis questions. Don't be shy.
Anybody?
Yeah, so after 15 years writing this first book, are you ready or have you started on the next one? Like, are you thinking of what comes next?
Well, I'm taking my second book to market next month. So I'm definitely not wasting any time. I think like one of the things that happened to me is that I never stopped thinking about ideas for books, like I'm one of those people that I feel like really lucky because my life feeds my creativity and my imagination a lot. And so, while I was working on editing the book, I started having these ideas about like this resort in the Dominican Republic and all the workers in it. And then when White Lotus came out, I was like, damn it, like they stole my idea. And it's so funny because when I gave it to my agent was like, this is not a White Lotus. Like, this is so good. So, we're taking that book to market next month. And then my thesis book that I put away, like I think when I was working with my editor, I had this light bulb moment where I was like, I know how to write plot. Like I figured out what was wrong with my first book that failed. And so I started working on that one. I'm halfway through revising it. And then I'm working on like this other like I want to try speculative fiction. So I start, and it's gonna be like very difficult, but I have like 40 pages of that. And it feels like three very different books, but like the same things I care about. Like it has to be sexy, it has to be propulsive. Like I want it to be like a page turner. It's concerned with class and gender, which I care about. But now I'm like, how do I make what I do better? So that's, and I feel like the books that I'm working on now, all of them are like slightly beyond my skill. Like they're just, I'm trying to pull some things off that I don't quite know how I'm going to do it. But I'm trusting that like I'll kind of rise to that level to do it. But I'm very excited. And one of the things I said to my friend, like, thank you for that question, because I was talking to one of my students and I said to my student, like, there's a scarcity mentality that I think sometimes especially in the literary landscape. I think a lot of times there's this idea that like there's a preciousness to language and that you have to be really careful and sparing. And I also am very interested in challenging this idea that we can't write excellent books, because I think that what I feel right now is like this kind of abundance. And the language is just pouring out of me, And I'm just like, I'm not going to stop it. I'm not going to hold it tight. I'm not going to be precious with it. Like, I'm going to write all the books and they're going to be great books. So thank you for that. Yeah, I love it.
This is going to be a little bit of a self-mirroring question to myself, but as somebody who's like not in the speaker English.
Yeah.
And I do love writing my thoughts and journaling and storytelling, but there's such a big imposter syndrome. Is like, is what I mean and feel well expressed in a language that's not what I grew up with, right?
Yeah.
And even when I don't even need to go as far as writing a book, but even telling a story feels like I have to constantly question myself.
Yes.
Be it a passion story at home or at work, and I'm like, okay, I need to convince my leaders that this is a good story, but am I saying, do I get acknowledged for what I want to say, or am I choosing the wrong words because they don't feel the same to somebody who's native, right?
Yeah.
So to you and having being so powerful and saying I will write it, and not only I'll be a bestseller, and not only I'll write more books. What factors made you get there and feel like, yes, I am a storyteller, and yes, it can be it's doable, and it doesn't matter if the English is not. Is this like small little moments, or you had like the big aha moment? How did you get to be so powerful to actually make it here today?
Oh, thank you for that question. And thank you for being vulnerable, because I think it's so hard to talk about these things. First of all, I can tell you, because there's a lot of writers I know here, that all of us have that feeling that we're not doing it the right way, that we don't have the right language. It doesn't matter whether you're a native English speaker or not. Like, everybody has those feelings of imposter syndrome. What I would say is that my own, and I really want you to answer that question, so think about it. My own feeling with like the ups and downs of being a writer is that, like, that is just like the ticket to like be a writer. It's like the price of admission is self-doubt. And so what I do is, if I find that it's so crippling that it's distracting me, I do something else. Like, I'm a big believer in like feeding your insecurities with like life. And so, like, I love visual, like art. Like, when I'm talking about the book as as an artifact or a structures, because I love sculptures, I love buildings, I love thinking about, like, if a building was a story, like, what shape is that, and can I make it do something funky, And so, like, I get really out of my head when I feel like those voices are getting so loud that they're getting in my way. So I would say, like, just think about what you love to do and do some of that, but like, just don't abandon the idea. The other thing that I want to say before I ask Leila to tell us is that, one of the best things that happens when you sell a book is that you find out that, like, the act of writing is quite collaborative, because, like, you're going to have an agent that's going to help you get it better. Like, you have to do your very best with the skill set you have, but then there's going to be other people that are going to help you be an even better writer. And so I think just don't put that pressure on yourself. Like, that's why now I'm like, I'm working on 3 books. Yep, I'm working on 3 books at the same time. And if I have it my way, I'm going to be publishing books for the next 5 years back to back, which the publishers probably won't let me do. But, it's like, that's what I want, is to have like one in the hopper, one ready to go, and another one at the beginning. And so I just think, like, you have to push yourself. And if you feel like the language you have isn't appropriate or like quite up to par, pick a character who's doing something you don't know how to do. Like, some of the best writers do that. Like, where like they'll have a person that's like in a ship, and then they have to learn all this language about ships and about, about the sea. And for me, like, I'm not a lawyer, but I decided to make my character a lawyer because I had worked around a lot of lawyers, and I was really interested in talking to lawyers about, because I think law, like, what it's meant to be is about justice, and freedom and liberty, but then it ends up being like this grind, in a really interesting way. I think, like, it's like a really interesting career. And I spent a lot of years talking to people, asking people about it, about like, what's it like being a lawyer? What's it like working in a law firm? Like, and just that curiosity about life, I think, will pay off big time. So anytime that you're feeling a little insecure, like, just find a florist, like, learn the words of some trees and write a story about that. You know what I mean? Like, write about something that maybe other people won't know if you don't know what the hell you're talking about, because it's so specific. And I think that's one of the tricks I use to just get out of my own head and out of my insecurity, because the insecurity is never going to go away. It doesn't matter how good you get at it. What about you? I'm so curious.
That's such a good tip. Yeah, it's so true. You learn it. Sometimes we go into these like rabbit holes of research, and sometimes you come out of them and you're like, I just wasted 16 hours. But sometimes they end up like giving you a whole other world of language. I mean, I think that get rid of the idea that there's like a right use of language. There's no right way to do it. And then remember that like every writer has like their own use of language, their own like way that they manipulate it, and that means like things like finding your rhythm, finding like the like cadence of your words. That is like a common language rhythm, and so if it sounds right to you, it's right. And I also think that there's like something so special about, you know, having more than one language in your kind of in language environment, because it means that you can get even more specific. You know, different sounds. There are different ways that like words will sound right, and every like addition, every new like unique thing about your specific voice creates a book that has its own song. And that's like what makes writing so beautiful, is like it develops its own language. So like let it be yours.
I love that. That's great advice. That's great. Any more questions? Yeah.
So what is your daily life like as a parent and a writer? And then can you speak to like what it means to like harness your career as a writer, and if there's any trade-offs with family life?
Yeah. That's like another hour of conversation. So the first part of the question was
How do you
like daily process, like how do we do it?
turn out these books and also
You know, I mean, I have to tell you something. Like, I think maybe it's because I spent so much time like working a job that I was very good at, but I didn't love, that it feels like a gift each time I sit down to write. And I just don't waste time, you know? Like, I feel like I have young children. I have an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. So it's like when I sit down to write, I sit down to write. And I spend a lot of time thinking about what I'm going to write, you know? So like I'm constantly just thinking about the story and thinking about the characters. And like, you know, I'm always putting characters in jams. I don't know how I'm going to get them out of. So for me, like part of the fun is like, what are they going to do, you know? And figuring that out. So I think like just setting up a schedule, you know, and like for me, that's what I do. Like I know there are certain days when, you know, and I give myself a goal, and, you know, the goal changes, you know, sometimes it's like a scene. And if I'm just not feeling especially inspired, like the scene might just be like a page and a half, you know, but then sometimes the scene will be 10 pages. The other thing is that I'm not precious about first drafts. Like I really believe that part of the reason why I've become such a better writer over the last 4 years, I think I became a better writer over the last 4 years than I was like the previous 10 years. And I think part of it is because what I realized is that I have really good ideas for stories. But like my first attempt at it is never that good. And what I used to do was like stay on the sentence by sentence until they were good. And that was very slow for me. So I was like adopting other people's process that I had heard, you know, that's how they did it. Sentence by sentence, everything perfect. I'm a sentence by sentence writer, but I realized that like my sentence by sentence means revision. Like I'll power through like a messy draft. And then I'll come back. And that's when I'm like gonna make it sing, when I'm gonna make it do something different, where I'm gonna add a lot of like the tricks I want to pull are like about language and about awkwardness and tension and like creating beautiful paragraphs and then breaking them up with something that feels awkward, because that's like my experience with language, and that's what I want to do. So I think like to me, like just not trying to pull tricks when you're going the first time and then saving the tricks for later. For me, like revision is writing for me. Like, so I just feel like the magic is gonna come later, and that gives me a lot of fuel to like get through the first. and the second drafts. And then, I think it's really tough when you're a parent. I mean, I'm like amazed at like any mother, any father, like any caretaker, who's responsible for other people. Sometimes they're like older people. Sometimes, they're like our pet animal babies, but it's like anyone who has responsibilities is like really hard to do it. But especially in the context of being a mother, because so often like it's uneven in our lives, most of our lives. It's uneven, and I'm very lucky that like in my household, my husband, my children's father is the primary parent. Like he really runs our house, and he's better at it than I am. So I consider myself like the backup parent. I don't know that my children see it that way because we both do a great deal of work. Like it's not like necessarily that, but like he does a lot of the coordinating. He does a lot of the whatever the processes of filling out. He does the grocery shopping, And so I've been really fortunate that I think I have a partner where like very early on in our relationship, we knew we wanted to have children when we met. We knew we wanted to get married. And I also knew that he was a non-traditional man. Like he wasn't someone that was going to sit around and wait for me to make a meal, So I think that to me was really important, like to have a partner who believes in equity and not like some made up kind of equity, like for real equity. Like if something needs to get done, he's going to do it. I think that matters. And for those of us who are in relationships where maybe that's not the case, I think negotiating that comes with tension, but it's really worth it. Because I don't think you can have a writing life if you're like a parent or responsible for caretaking responsibilities in the home without having like an explicit agreement. The thing about writing too is that you're not going to see the yield right away. Like sometimes you can work on a project for years before it's a book. Mm-hmm. And so, I think having someone who understands why it's important to you. My husband, I was very successful, in case you can tell. in my previous career, I was like making cash, like I was bringing home some bacon. And when I quit my job, it was really scary because it was like, like we had gotten used to a certain lifestyle, and like he bought in. I was like, I don't know what our life is gonna look like, but I'm willing to give up my Louis Vuittons and like I'm willing to give up the fancy hotel and maybe stay at Airbnbs or whatever, and he was down for that. But I think what has really transformed our relationship is that I am the happiest I've been my entire life. And so I don't know that would be the same for everybody, because I actually find myself very fulfilled. Even when I'm getting rejected, even when like, I just got 3 rejections this week. I was like, do these people know who I am? Like, what's wrong with them, But it's like the rejections come. But then I'm like, I've written something that's so special. Like, I know I've done something important. And, I don't know that I ever thought before the book was out in the world, it was so painful to not have the book out in the world. Like, I don't know that I ever thought the thing could be meaningful by itself, even if it never hit the light of day. And yes, I want all my work to hit the light of the day, but there's like this beauty in the creation process. I think it helps me understand my humanity in a way that I don't think I was as deeply invested before. So I think like just being able to like show my husband like he sees it, but also like now he can hear me talk about it. Like I can explain it. Like this is connected to my journey as a human being, and that's why it's important, and not just a hobby or like something I'm doing so you gotta like go to the grocery store. It's like something that's deeply connected to who I am as a human being. I think that makes a big difference. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it really does.
All right, last question.
Yeah. As you know, I'm a Dominican immigrant myself, and I was raised in New York City. And in reading the book, it felt so real to me, like the language, the environment, like the entire structure. So I'm thinking, if it felt real to me, how did it feel to the people in your family? And I mean, because I know these people.
Yeah.
But you're talking from your point of view.
Yeah.
So if I felt that way, how did the people in your family feel, and did you get any backlash from that?
I did. I mean, my situation has been pretty painful at home. Like on the one hand, let me just say that like the majority of the people who love me love my book and have read it. I'm sad my mom hasn't read it because it's not in Spanish and she doesn't read English. But I did have a big misunderstanding by some of my family members who thought the book was, they hadn't read the book, first of all. And they thought that I was like somehow writing about my grandmother and that, you know, I had said some really terrible things about my grandmother. And it was such a messy situation where like I couldn't even unwind it. Like, I really apologized to people because I was like, that's not what this book is, but I'm so sorry if you think that's what it is. Like, I would never do that. But you know what I was thinking about when like this whole thing happened? What it stemmed from was an essay that I turned into an autofiction piece years ago. It has nothing to do with this book. But it's really about the domestic abuse that like was happening in my home when I was growing up. And it was also about sexual abuse that happened in my home when I was growing up. And I turned a lot of those experiences into a short story. So, you know, that short story had nothing to do with my grandmother, but there was a sentence in it that was like where a daughter is talking to her mother about the grandmother being an asshole, you know, and one of my aunts got a hold of the story and then told everybody that this is what Neruda in the Park was about. And that had been like part of this. And so like my family, like when I told you like my mom's one of 12, like 10 aunts and uncles like boycotted me, wouldn't talk to me, like, you know, weren't present last year when like all these beautiful things were happening with the book. And you know what I was thinking? I was like, because, you know, success does that. You become so generous. I was like, oh, these poor people, like, you know, they don't even know what they're talking about. But then, you know, like when I really started thinking about how silence works, and it was like this pressure that I felt like you shouldn't be talking about the things we're not supposed, even though that's not what even this book is. I felt then like how prevalent in our homes this, like, we have a contract that is like, you don't tell people the really messy, terrible things that happen in our homes. It's an embarrassment and you're embarrassing us. So, you know, there was a part of me that felt, I don't know, like it made me bolder in a way about like needing to say what I need to say. Because if that backlash I got for something that was not even related, like imagine me writing about these horrible experiences I had as a kid. And like the abuse that my mom suffered, the abuse that me and my siblings suffered at the hands of this man that was like a predator. And like there's one sentence in it where like one character says a grandmother is an asshole. And then an entire family like will boycott you because you insulted your grandmother. But like what that story was about was a man that was like abusing and you know, just being violent to so many of us. And so, you know, I was thinking about that, like how for me, like really helped me understand, like this is why so many of our families, like things don't get better, you know, because it's like instead of looking at the thing we're supposed to be looking at, we're like distracted by one sentence that has nothing to do with the thing we're talking about. So I thank you for that question because, you know, it felt like really painful at the time and I felt like so terrible. And then, I don't know, like in a way, I was like, well, if people stop talking to me, I must be doing something right. Like if people want to, you know, like cut me out of the family, I must be doing something that threatens the status. And maybe what I'm doing is actually worth it, you know. So thank you.
Everyone, please give it up for Cleyvis.
And thank you to Leila. Thank you.
Buy a book. And if you already have a book, buy a book for someone you love.
Aww.
So everyone should be walking out of here with a book.
And buy Leila's book because she's wonderful. And thank you, Booksmith, for hosting me. This was such a lovely event. Thank you so much.